The forest was silent, but not the kind of silence that calms a man. It was the heavy stillness that makes the skin tighten, as if the trees themselves were listening. The air pressed down with the damp smell of rotting leaves and wet earth. A chill moved through the wind, thin but sharp enough to sting the face. Every step cracked twigs and shifted damp soil, a sound too loud in the suffocating quiet. Daniel pulled his coat tighter. He wasn't sure if the shiver running through him came from the cold or from the fear gnawing at his stomach. He and Mark had set out early, just after sunrise, rifles on their shoulders, expecting a clean hunt in the backcountry of northern Pennsylvania. Now, hours later, the light was slipping away and nothing looked familiar. The compass needle spun steady, but the trails twisted until they didn't seem like trails at all. Mark cursed under his breath. "We've circled this ridge before. I swear I saw that split oak already." His voice was low, rough, with frustration. He wiped sweat from his brow, though the wind was cold. Hunger was beginning to chew at both of them. They had eaten little since the morning, thinking they'd be back by noon. Daniel glanced up. The canopy blocked most of the sky, but what little he could see was grey, the daylight fading into something darker. "We'll find the way," he said, though he wasn't sure. His throat was dry, his legs sore. He could feel the ache deep in his knees with every uneven step downhill. The stillness of the woods turned into a weight. The occasional crack of a branch far off made their hearts pound. Each sound carried the threat of being watched, or worse, being alone forever in the endless sprawl of trees. The wind shifted, carrying a damp cold that smelled of moss and rain. Mark stopped walking. He dropped his pack on a fallen log and sat heavily. "I can't keep pretending we're just off course. We're lost, Daniel." His voice cracked, not from anger this time, but from fear. The kind that comes when pride collapses. Daniel didn't answer right away. His chest burned, not just from exhaustion but from the truth of Mark's words. They were lost, deep enough that no distant highway hum reached them, no faint smell of smoke from a farmhouse carried on the air. Only trees, endless trees, whispering with each gust of wind. He sank to the ground, feeling the wet earth soak through the knees of his pants. He rubbed his face, rough with stubble. His breath came shallow. "We'll keep moving tomorrow. Tonight we rest." His voice sounded smaller than he intended, but it was all he had left. The forest grew darker, the air colder. They sat without speaking, the weight of fear settling on their shoulders heavier than their rifles. The night would be long, and they knew hunger and exhaustion would only deepen. But in that moment, all they had was the fragile hope that the morning would bring light, direction, and maybe some mercy. And if you've been pulled into this story, if you feel the ache of the cold ground and the dread in the dark woods, stay with us. Subscribe, keep reading, and don't let go of the path. Because the deeper the night, the more powerful the moment when light finally breaks through. Cold took the ground first. It crept through fabric, through skin, into bone. Daniel felt it in his teeth when he clenched his jaw. Mark fed needles and small twigs into a tiny fire they nursed beneath a boulder's lip. Smoke drifted sideways, thin and pale, and then was swallowed by the trees. The flame wasn't much, but it held back the dark at arm's length. Beyond that, the forest was a wall. They didn't talk about fear. They talked about small things. Mark said the brake light on his truck had been acting up again. Daniel said he should borrow a tester when they got back. Hunger came on slow. Daniel's stomach tightened and loosened in waves. They had a little jerky, a few nuts, and a single granola bar they decided to save. Mark stared at the fire, like it might confess a way home if he kept looking long enough. Wind rattled high branches. Now and then something moved in the brush, quiet and quick. A coyote's yip rose and fell, and silence settled thicker right after. Daniel held still and listened to his breath. It came harsh. He imagined the map back in the truck, the line of roads, the curving creeks. None of that mattered here. Here, a man's world shrank to the reach of his hands and the heat of a small flame. "Tomorrow we follow the draw," Mark said. "Water runs to roads." "Downhill then," Daniel answered. He tried to believe in the simple plan. He tried to believe morning would show them a shape they knew. They built a lean shape of branches against the stone and pulled their coats over their legs. The earth was damp. Pain grew in Daniel's knees and lower back, the kind of ache that doesn't announce itself with a sharp stab, but with a steady gnawing that makes a man question every decision he has made. He thought of his wife, Emily, who hated the thought of him going out alone. He thought of their boy, Caleb, who liked to count the deer on the wall and ask about each one. He saw their faces in the dark, and it steadied him in a way that sleep never could. When sleep came, it was thin. Daniel drifted, woke, drifted again. He dreamed he was in a narrow hallway lined with trees instead of doors. At the end, a dim light pulsed. As he reached for it, the hallway stretched away. He woke with his heart hammering, mouth dry, listening to Mark turn in his sleep. Sometime after midnight, the fire died. The cold pressed closer. Daniel curled on his side and pulled his coat tight, hand over the pocket where the compass rested. He told himself that the needle had meaning. That morning would untie the knots these hills had tied around them. He whispered a short prayer he hadn't said in years. Just, God, help us find the way. Wind shifted again, carrying a damp edge that hinted at rain. In that edge, fear returned, heavier than before, sitting on Daniel's chest like weight. He closed his eyes and counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. The forest listened back. Grey light seeped into the trees and showed more trees. The fire was ash, cool and soft, smeared by a boot print Mark didn't remember making. Daniel's fingers were stiff. He flexed them and felt pins and needles race along his palms. They ate the last of the jerky and split the granola bar. It tasted like cardboard. Mark drank a swallow from the metal bottle and handed it to Daniel. Ration it, he said, though he knew they both wanted to tilt it back and finish it. Fog hung in the hollows. The ground sloped toward a shallow draw, choked with deadfall and thick brush. They followed it, stepping over slick logs, pushing through tight stands of saplings, listening for water. Somewhere ahead, a creek spoke in a thin voice. Mark glanced at the compass, then the sky, then the slant of the hillside. Down and east, he said. We keep that line. He tried to sound confident. Daniel didn't argue. The plan was as good as any. They found the creek sooner than they expected, a narrow ribbon sliding over stones. Kneeling, Daniel dipped his fingers. The water was clean and cold. He wanted to put his face into it and drink until the ache in his throat vanished. They had a small filter tucked in Mark's pack. They filled the bottle, took careful sips, and walked. The creek wound back and forth like a lazy thought, and the banks rose in places. Wet. Leaves turned each step into a risk. Daniel slipped once, caught himself and laughed in relief. The second time his boot skidded over moss, and he fell hard. A branch jabbed into his thigh. Pain flashed white and then settled into a deep throb. Mark crouched beside him. You good? Yeah, Daniel lied through his teeth. He rolled his pants up. A long scrape bled slowly, just enough to smear. He wrapped it with a strip torn from the inside of his shirt and tied it tight. Rain began as a fine spray, barely there at first and then more insistent. The trees clicked and hissed as drops found needles and leaves. They kept moving until noon wasn't noon anymore, just a dimming of the thin light. We need a break. He leaned against a boulder, chest heaving. Daniel sat on a root, leg pulsing with each heartbeat. Hunger clawed again, sharper now. There was nothing left to eat. They didn't talk about rescue. They didn't talk about dying. They talked about dumb things. Daniel said the freezer needed defrosting. Mark said he'd promised his sister he'd fix a stair rail before Thanksgiving. They kept the talk small because the big talk scared them. When they stood again, Daniel's leg gave out. He caught himself on the boulder and tasted bile. Mark slipped an arm under his shoulder. We go slower, Mark said, but we go. The creek curved, and a faint game trail appeared, guiding them through a stand of hemlock that smelled like a wet fence. For a while they moved without thinking. Then the trail vanished, swallowed by ferns and shadow, and they were alone again with the sound of water and wind. By late afternoon, rain turned steady. It made everything look the same. Grey water on grey bark, dark ground glistening like oil. Daniel's leg felt hot, not warm but hot, and he wondered if the scrape was deeper than he had thought. He said nothing. He needed Mark's hope as much as his arm. They found a shallow overhang on the side of a rock seam. It offered just enough, shelter to take their packs off and breathe without rain in their faces. Mark took off his hat and squeezed water from the brim. "We camp here," he said, tired beyond argument. They gathered what dry wood they could find under fallen logs and low branches. The first match flared and died. Mark cupped the second with both hands and his body, and this time the twigs caught, a weak orange lick working at the edges. Smoke made their eyes water. Daniel fed the flame until it had a voice. When heat finally reached them, it brought more than warmth. It brought a little space to think. Daniel stretched his leg, checked the cloth. It was wet with rain and a thin strip of pink. He cleaned it with bottled water, wincing, then wrapped it with the last clean bandage from their kit. "Tell me about Caleb," Mark said, voice flat, eyes on the fire. "6 in January, Daniel said. "He wants a bike he can ride without training wheels." He could see the boy's stubborn mouth, the way he clenched it when he tried something hard. "Emily says he prays at night that I'll bring home a buck so he can tell Grandpa he helped." He swallowed. "I should have left a better note on the counter." Mark nodded. "I told my sister I'd be back to move her couch. She's probably cussing me out right now." Rain tapped the rock overhead in a steady, patient rhythm. They fell quiet. The fire popped. The woods breathed. A kind of grief rose between them, not because anything had ended, but because nothing was certain. Men who counted on their bodies and the land don't like to admit that both can turn. "Think God pays attention to fools who get themselves turned around?" Mark asked after a long time. He tried to sound like he was joking. It didn't land that way. Daniel rubbed his hands near the heat. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't talked to him much." He remembered his mother's voice in a church basement years ago, telling him God was near to the broken. He had not felt near to anything except cold and pain for 2 days. They slept in shifts. When Daniel woke to take his turn, the rain had softened. He watched the dark trees and listened for anything that didn't belong. Once, far off, a helicopter droned. He stood and waved his hat in the open. The sound faded, swallowed by cloud and distance. When he sat again, the defeat felt heavier than his soaked jacket. Just before dawn, the fire stumbled to coals. Mark stirred, teeth chattering. "We keep moving," he said, and the words were a promise, made to no one and to everything. Morning showed the creek running stronger from the night's rain. Mud sucked at their boots. Each step pulled like a small hand. Daniel's leg ached with each pull, and a dull heat spread above the bandage. He kept his jaw tight and saved his breath for moving. Mark scanned the banks for tracks, for any sign of deer that might bring meat. Their rifles felt heavy and foolish now. Big iron in a place where a man needed a pot, a stove, a dry bed. Still, hunger made them hope for anything. When a rabbit flashed from cover, Mark swung too slow and too tired. The shot cracked sharp in the damp air and vanished into trees. No rabbit, no second chance. "Waste of a round," Mark muttered, shame flushing his face. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing to say that would help. They followed the creek until it split into fingers, each one weaker, each one a question. They chose the left branch because the hillside to the right was steeper and looked like trouble. The left branch led them into tighter brush and dead pine that snapped underfoot like bones. By noon, the sky sagged low again. It didn't rain, but it threatened, the kind of sky that makes a man feel small. They stopped and drank filtered water that tasted like pennies. Daniel's stomach clenched from emptiness, and then from the water itself. He breathed slow until it eased. "Road has to be somewhere," Mark said, voice ragged. "A logging cut. A power line." He was speaking faith to keep both of them moving. Afternoon blurred into a long throb of steps and breath. They crossed a small marsh where cattails bent under their weight and cold water filled their boots. Daniel stumbled and nearly went to his knees. Mark grabbed his coat and hauled him upright. "Easy," he said, and his voice held more fear than he meant to show. They found a stand of birch white as bone, and for a moment the world looked different. Roads, Daniel thought. People lay gravel someplace near birch because the ground is high. He pushed forward, eyes searching for a cut, for trash, for any dirty sign that humans had been here. Nothing. Late light came early. The woods dimmed. Daniel's leg throbbed in a slow drumbeat that matched his heart. He felt weak in a way that scared him. Not the weakness of a long day, but the kind that hollows a man from the inside, leaving only breath and will. They made camp under a fallen spruce, the branches thick enough to deflect wind. Mark scraped a little fire together and fed, died like a beggar. The flame took, fought, and finally steadied. They warmed their hands and said nothing. Hunger gnawed, mean and steady. "Tomorrow," Daniel said after a long time, "we follow the water as far as it goes. Then we climb to a ridge and look. If there's nothing, we head west by the compass and keep to it." Mark nodded. The plan sounded hard and honest. He could hold on to that. Night pressed close again, and the fire painted their faces the color of tired blood. The next day, the wind rose and cut through the trees with a low, steady sound that felt like warning. The creek dwindled to a trickle. When the water disappeared, they turned uphill toward a ridge that seemed close and stayed far. Daniel moved in careful steps, testing each footfall. The bandage had soaked again and a rusty stain showed through. He felt light-headed when he stood too quickly. Mark watched him and said nothing because he didn't know what else he could do except be there and carry more weight. At the top of a long slope, they reached a line of old blazes on oak trunks, faint cuts in bark filled with dark callus. The marks ran north to south. A trail once ran here. Maybe a club kept it. Maybe nobody had come through in years. "North," Mark said, looking at the compass. "Power lines, maybe. Or a road cut." They followed the faint line, stepping over rot-soft logs that collapsed under a boot like loaves of bread gone to mold. The sky opened a little and then closed again. The wind carried a new sound, a distant thok-thok-thok that made both men stop and lift their heads. "Helicopter," Daniel said. He felt hope bloom and then clamp itself down for fear of wasting it. They stepped into a small clearing and waved their orange caps high. The sound grew, passed to the east and faded. The sky showed nothing but moving cloud. Mark swore again, but there was no anger in it, only fatigue. "They're looking," he said. "They just don't know where we are." Afternoon slid into evening. Cloud broke without warning, and a brief shaft of sun lit the ridge, warming their faces and showing dust in the air. It was gone as quickly as it came, like a hand that touched a man's shoulder and then left him to stand on his own. "Signal?" Daniel asked, pulling his phone from an inside pocket that had kept it dry. One bar blinked and vanished. He lifted it, stepped on a rock, tried again. Nothing. The battery showed red. "Turn it off," Mark said. "Save it for when we see lines or a rise with a view." They made a small camp on the ridge in the lee of a stump as wide as a barrel. Mark tucked spruce boughs around them to cut wind. The fire fought the gusts and held. They warmed their boots and socks and tried to dry them without scorching. Daniel stared into the coals until they blurred. He thought of his father, who had taught him to read the land and then died 2 summers ago. The old man's voice returned now, plain as ever. "Keep your head. Keep moving. Pray when you can't." Daniel had not wanted to be that son who remembered faith because he needed something. He was that son anyway. Night didn't bring sleep so much as it brought a long, numb wait for morning. In the dark, Daniel heard the wind and his own heart. He whispered again, not sure who heard. "We need a way through," he said, and the words tasted like truth, more than like prayer. By mid-morning, the ridge split into 2 long spines. They chose the right-hand one because it had less blowdown. The air grew colder as clouds thickened, and a fine sleet began to tap the hoods of their jackets. Daniel's breath turned white. He was moving slower now, each step measured, each pause longer than the last. Mark took more of the gear and looped the rifles together with a strap so he could carry both. "You focus on your feet," he said. "I'll handle the rest." The words were firm, but fear stood behind them, visible in the tight set of his mouth. They dropped off the spine into a shallow saddle and then faced a short, steep climb up the other side. Halfway up, Daniel's boots slipped on wet leaves. He fell forward, caught himself on his hands, and slid. The movement tore at the bandage. Heat and weakness burst through him. When he tried to stand, the world tilted. He went to one knee and stayed there, head down. "I just need a minute," he said, though minutes had stopped helping. Sweat, cold as rain, ran down his back. His hands trembled. He could hear Mark above him, breathing hard, wood creaking under boots. "Hey," Mark said, coming down a step, crouching close. "No, look at me." Daniel looked. Mark's eyes were red at the edges. "We're going to stand. 1, 2... "Give me a second," Daniel said. He felt like a man inside a well, the light far above and thin. A humming began in his ears that hid the noise of the wind. "Just wait." Mark swallowed and nodded. He sat beside him on the slope, mud soaking his jeans. "When I was a kid," Mark said, voice even, "my granddad got turned around picking mushrooms. He said he felt like the woods were closing in on him. He sat down and sang church songs he barely remembered, until he could think straight. Said it wasn't fancy. Said it worked." Daniel almost laughed. "You going to sing?" "I will if you don't stand up." They tried again. Mark planted his boots and hauled Daniel by the back of his coat. Daniel groaned, teeth grinding. He stood, swayed, steadied. They climbed the rest of the slope in small, ugly steps, stopping often, refusing to look at the distance left. At the top, wind cut through them without mercy. The ridge ran toward a darker line that might have been higher ground or storm. They didn't make a fire that night. Wind made it foolish and dangerous. They huddled behind a rock that gave almost no shelter and let the cold do what it does. Daniel shook in waves that started in his back and moved outward until his teeth rattled. At some point, he stopped shaking. That scared Mark more than anything. "Stay with me," Mark said, voice close to breaking. "Say something." Daniel's lips felt numb. "Okay," he breathed. It didn't sound like a word. It sounded like air escaping. When morning finally came, it arrived without color, just a lighter gray. Daniel was awake, but a part of him felt far away, as if he had left pieces of himself behind him in the wet leaves all the way back down the hill. Morning gave them a hard, clear hour before clouds closed again. They dropped off the ridge to the west, because the slope looked kinder, and the trees less broken. Halfway down, they found the sound they needed most, water over stone. A new creek stitched along the base of the ridge, brown with tannin, cold as iron. They followed it, moving slower than any map would suggest, because the ground along creeks is a mess of roots and slick rock. Daniel stumbled often. Mark stayed close and took his elbow without making a show of it. Pride had been peeled away by now. Only the need to keep going remained. Around noon, they reached a flat, where the creek widened and slid under a fallen pine. On the far bank stood a post cracked by weather. A metal square clung to it by one rusted screw. Mark waded across, water filling his boots with a gasp of cold, and scraped the plate with his knife until letters showed, "No motor vehicles." Below it, in small print, a faded line, "State Game Lands." Daniel put both hands on the post and let his head drop. Not rescued, not home, but proof that people had built something here once. Lines meant management. Management meant roads, even if they were far. His throat tightened and he swallowed it down. They kept the creek on their right and moved downstream. The banks opened into a long, damp meadow where grass lay flat from earlier floods. In the mud near the edge, Mark found boot prints, old, washed soft but human. He crouched, touched the edges, and felt a little strength return to his arms. "We're not the only fools," he said. Daniel almost smiled. Afternoon brought a slow, steady terrain that slicked everything again. The meadow narrowed, forcing them back into dark trees. Daniel's leg burned like wire. He fell once and stayed down, breath ragged, vision pulsing. Mark knelt beside him. "We stop," he said. "We stop here." They made a shelter from the pine boughs and the old tarp Mark carried. The fire took more coaxing than they had fingers for, but at last it burned, low and blue at the base. Steam rose from their clothes, and the air smelled like wet wool and smoke. Daniel lay on his side, teeth clenched, and let the heat find him. "Let me look," Mark said. He unwrapped the bandage. The scrape was angry red and swollen at the edges. "We clean it," he said. He poured a cap of alcohol, and Daniel hissed as it bit. They rewrapped with a strip torn from the inside of Daniel's coat, the last clean cloth between them. "Tomorrow we push," Mark said, more to himself than to Daniel. "We follow the creek until we hit a road. There has to be one." Daniel stared at the fire. He felt like he was looking down a long tunnel towards something small and bright. He didn't know if it was help or the end of himself. Outside the shelter, rain eased. Wind moved through the trees in a way that sounded almost like a voice too far away to understand. They started before full light, hoping to steal distance from the day before it found a way to take it back. The creek curved through a tangle of alder and then fell over a small ledge into a pool the color of tea. On the other side, the land opened into mixed hardwoods. For a while the walking was easier. Then the ground pitched up without warning, the creek dropping away to the right, and they were climbing again, hands on trunks, boots slipping. Halfway up, Daniel's leg gave a hard pulse of pain that emptied his lungs. He bent double, caught himself against a tree, and tasted something metallic. When he looked down, he saw fresh blood darkening the cloth. The world blurred at the edges. He heard Mark say his name, and then it sounded far away, like a voice through rain. "I'm fine," Daniel said automatically, and then his knees buckled. The sky spun in slow circles above him. The ground felt both too hard and too soft, like it was swallowing him while it pressed his ribs. Mark was there at once, dropping to his knees. He pressed a hand against the bandage and felt heat, real heat, not just from effort. "You're not fine," he said, voice steady because it had to be. "Hey, stay with me." Daniel heard, but his body wasn't listening. He felt a long wave move through him, the kind that steals strength and leaves a man hollow. He remembered Caleb in a flash, so sharp it hurt. The little bike, the stubborn mouth. Emily at the sink, turning toward him with that look she had when he was late. "Breathe," Mark said. "Look at me." He tore open the bandage and poured water, then alcohol. Daniel gasped, the pain white and clean for a moment. Mark rewrapped it tight with strips from his shirt, then from the sleeve he ripped from his coat. He wouldn't think about what they would do tomorrow when there was nothing left to use. "Can you stand?" Daniel tried. The attempt ended in a sharp, choked sound and a shake of his head. His arms trembled. Sweat ran cold in his hairline. Mark looked up the slope, then down. He looked at the creek. He looked at his friend, pale and breathing too fast. The world narrowed to choices he hated. He slid his arms under Daniel's and lifted, dragging him to a flatter spot behind a log. "We wait," he said. "We rest. Then we move." Time turned strange. The sky brightened, then dimmed without edges. Daniel drifted in and out, hearing water, hearing wind, hearing Mark speak low words that sounded like prayer, though he would deny it later. When Daniel woke again, his lips were cracked and his hands shook. "Hey," Mark said, relief running through the word. "You with me?" "Yeah," Daniel swallowed. "We have to go." They did not go far. Every 10 yards felt like a small war at last, just past a bend where the creek widened and slowed. Daniel's legs quit. He sagged sideways and the world went grey. Mark caught him and eased him down. "Enough," Mark said, and there was no room for argument left in either of them. Late day settled over the creek. Mark had run out of words and ran low on strength. The thought of leaving Daniel to find help came and went, and each time he pushed it away. He could not walk away from the breathing he felt against his chest. Rain began again. Light at first, then stronger. It pattered on leaves and found every gap in their clothes. Mark kept his eyes on the bend. That was when the figure appeared, as ordinary as a man could be in a place like that. No halo, no light. just a man in a dark coat and a cap pulled low, stepping from the trees with the kind of ease a person has when he knows the ground by heart. He came closer without hurry. "You boys look like you've had enough," he said, voice plain, the consonants of the hills in it. He knelt beside Daniel and slid an arm under his back with a sure hand. "Let me help." Mark's first thought was fear, but it faded when the man's hands moved. There was no rush, no show, just strength and steadiness. He smelled of smoke and rain. "I'm Mark," Mark said. "This is Daniel. He's hurt." "I can see," the man said. He eased Daniel upright and held him. Daniel opened his eyes and saw a face weathered like bark, eyes calm, mouth set in a kind line. "Water?" the man asked. He uncapped a bottle from his own coat and held it to Daniel's lips. Daniel drank. "How did you find us?" Mark said. He found himself whispering. "I heard the shot yesterday," the man said. "Been walking the creeks. Folks get stuck here." He looked at the bandage. "That needs real hands on it." He stood, slid his hands under Daniel's arms. "On three." They stood together. "Follow the water to a wide bend with a dead pine across it," the man said. "On the left there's an old timber road cut. Doesn't look like much until you're on it. Keep to that cut and you'll hit a gate. Past the gate you might find a bit of signal." They moved. The pace felt chosen for them. When Daniel stumbled, the man lifted without strain. "Who are you?" Mark asked once. The man smiled, just a small turn of his mouth. "Just someone who knows the way." They reached the bend as dusk thickened. The dead pine lay exactly where he had said, grey and huge across the water. To the left, a faint corridor ran into the brush. The man guided them into it. "Keep going," he said. "Don't stop on the first hill, it gets better after." He placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You're not alone." When Mark turned to thank him, the man had already stepped back into the trees. The space where he'd stood held the smell of smoke and something like clean air after a storm. They followed the faint road cut by headlamp and by feel, each rut a shallow trough full of wet leaves. The grade climbed and then fell, then climbed again. Daniel leaned into Mark on the worst parts. "Keep going," Mark said. "He said it gets better." He said it like an order he trusted more than his own judgment. A short rise led them to a bench where the trees thinned. The rain slackened. In the open, the road cut showed clearer, two worn lines bordered by scrub. They moved faster for a while, warmed by motion and by the sense that something at last ran in a straight line. "Stop," Daniel said, breath sharp. He braced a hand on his thigh and waited for a wave of dizziness to pass. Mark steadied him. They stood like that, two men holding each other up, nothing heroic about it, only need and stubborn care. What he didn't say was that he felt close to tears. The road and the memory of that calm voice pressed on him. The cut turned to the left and then dipped into a shallow hollow where water gathered in a long puddle. On the far side, the mud held fresh prints. The tread looked odd, regular but not modern. Mark crouched and touched the rim. He shivered and stood. They climbed the next hill and found the gate. It stood across the cut metal pipe and chain with a faded yellow marker. Beyond it, the trees opened and a grey line ran east-west. An actual road, narrow and rough, but road all the same. Mark pulled his phone and held it high. 1 bar, then 2. A breathless sound left his throat, part laugh, part sob. He tapped 911 with a thumb that shook. It rang. When the dispatcher answered, Mark's voice came out flat and careful, like he was naming parts at a counter. 2 hunters lost, he said. 1 injured and weak. We're at a locked gate on a timber road in the state game lands. Battery low. The call cut. The phone went black. It was enough. They eased Daniel under the gate and sat him with his back to the post. Wind moved softer now. In the quiet, Mark looked back the way they had come. The cut ran between dark trees, a narrow throat where a man could disappear. "I want to thank him," Mark said. "Me too," Daniel answered. They waited. Minutes stretched. In the dim light, shapes teased the eye. Mark thought he saw motion once, a figure near the bend where the road dipped. He stood and raised his hand. "Hey!" he called. No one answered. No one stepped into view. The cut held only rain-dark trunks and the steam of wet ground easing into cool air. They heard the truck before they saw it, a low growl over the rattle of branches. Two lights bounced along the grey line to the east, then slowed. A white county pickup rolled to a stop near the gate. Behind it came a second vehicle with orange flashers. Two men in jackets stepped out. One had a radio on his chest and the cautious eyes of someone who has walked into a lot of bad situations and hopes this isn't one. "You the lost party?" he asked, voice calm. Mark stood on shaky legs. "Yes, he needs a medic." He pointed to Daniel, who tried to rise and failed. The officer crouched, took in the bandage, the pallor, the shaking that started and stopped. "We've got you," the officer said. He spoke into his radio and then into Daniel's eyes. "Ambulance is staging down the road. You're not our first tonight, and you won't be our last." The words were gentle without being soft. They lifted Daniel onto a backboard they had brought and slid him into the truck's bed. Every jolt hurt, but the pain felt like a promise that something might finally change. Mark climbed into the other truck and watched the gate swing open in the rearview mirror like a door. That should have opened 2 days ago. At the paved road the ambulance waited, lights turning the wet night into red and white streaks. Inside, a paramedic with grey hair and a steady voice checked Daniel's pulse, his temperature, the wound. "You did what you could," she said, nodding at the bandage. She started an IV that felt like fire and then relief. "We'll get you warm, we'll get you fed, we'll get you home." Mark stood outside for a moment, letting the rain hit his face, feeling the world take its shape again. A young deputy handed him a blanket and a bottle of water. "Lucky you found that gate," the deputy said. "That cut runs forever if you miss it." "We had help," Mark said, eyes on the dark trees beyond the shoulder. "A man showed us the way." The deputy followed his gaze. "One of our volunteers?" "I don't think so." The deputy shrugged, not unkind. "Sometimes folks show up." He looked tired, like he had seen enough to stop asking for explanations he didn't need. They loaded, Mark into the front, and the little convoy moved. In the ambulance, Daniel stared at the ceiling and tried to stay awake. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road felt like being rocked. He thought of the man's hand under his arms. He remembered the words, "You're not alone." He let them settle somewhere deep where fear had dug a trench. At the hospital, bright light and heat felt foreign. They cut his pant leg and cleaned the wound until the angry red eased under clear fluid and bandage. A nurse fed him broth that tasted like salt and kindness. Mark sat in a chair with a paper cup of coffee, cooling in his hands, and didn't speak because he didn't trust his voice not to crack open and spill. Morning came in a hospital window, rectangle of pale light on a beige wall. Daniel woke to the quiet beeps of monitors and the slow warmth of blankets piled high. His leg ached, but the wild heat was gone. He felt emptied out and strangely clear. Emily arrived with eyes bright from a night of fear. She held his hand like it might float away if she loosened her grip. Caleb stood at the foot of the bed, small and serious, his hands in the pockets of a jacket 2 sizes too big. Mark leaned against the doorframe, unshaven, worn down, and alive. The doctor spoke in simple words. Infection had started. Rest, antibiotics, food, time. Daniel nodded at each instruction, like a man signing a contract he had already decided to honor. When the room emptied and he was alone with Mark, they sat, without speaking for a long stretch. "What do we call him?" Mark asked at last. "The man?" "Yeah." Mark stared at the floor like the answer might show up in the tiles. "Volunteer? Hiker? Angel?" He laughed once, short. "I sound like someone I'd make fun of." Daniel looked at the ceiling and let the white tiles blur. "We call him Help," he said. "We call him Real." He felt the words in his chest as much as he heard them. "I don't know what else to say." Mark rubbed his jaw. "When he lifted you, I felt something, Like the room got wider. He shook his head. I don't even talk like that. You do now, Daniel said. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was just telling the truth he had. Later, a chaplain stopped by and asked if they wanted prayer. Daniel surprised himself by saying yes. The chaplain didn't give a speech. He said a few quiet words and left a small booklet on the table. Daniel didn't open it. He didn't need pages to tell him what he already knew. He had asked for help, and help had come. At home a week later, the leg healing, Daniel sat on the porch as evening came down soft. The air smelled of cut grass and rain beginning somewhere far off. He could hear a neighbor's dog and the distant sound of a train, like a promise that roads and tracks still ran across the world. Mark pulled up and took the porch steps slow, a six-pack of soda in hand. They sat in the dark with the porch light off, talking in a tired, honest way about the same old things: work, bills, small plans. The talk kept circling back to the creek and the road and the man in the cap. Each time they came to it, the words fell away, and a quiet settled that felt like respect. What if it was Jesus? Mark asked in the kind of voice people use when they say something tender for the first time. Daniel didn't rush his answer. It felt like him, he said at last. Not the Sunday school picture, not shiny, just there when we needed him, lifting when we couldn't. He let the sentence end without a period, more feeling than statement, and they sat in the deepening dark until the porch light clicked on by itself. They went back a month later, not to hunt, but to see. The first cold had come, and the hills wore late color, rust, brown, the last stubborn gold in the low places. They parked at the same lot, signed the register, and walked in with light packs and better sense. The creek was lower now, clear over the stones. They found the bend with the dead pine, the wide back of it bleached and flaking. The timber road cut showed in the leaves like a scar. Daniel stood where he remembered falling. He stood where he remembered being lifted. The air was still. The memory wasn't. A truck rolled up the service road and stopped. The man behind the wheel was older than both of them, shoulders square, face cut deep with weather. A state patch sat on his jacket. He climbed out slow and nodded. Afternoon. Afternoon, Mark said. We got lost out here a few weeks back. The ranger's eyebrows rose a fraction. You two? He studied them, and then the creek. We had teams on this section 3 nights that week. Found a couple of hikers, a father and son, a bird watcher who swore he didn't need help. He smiled a little. You boys walked a long way. We had help, Daniel said. He was not sure why he felt shy saying it. Volunteer? The ranger asked, same as the deputy had. We don't know. Mark glanced at Daniel. A man in a dark coat, knew the cuts, showed us the way to the gate. The ranger looked down at the ruts. Lot of old hands know these roads. He kicked a stone with his boot. Funny thing, though. That week, the register shows only one volunteer in this quadrant, and he never left the east side. He shrugged. Could be I missed a line. Daniel nodded. The answer didn't bother him. He didn't need proof. The ranger looked at him, eyes softening in a way that said he understood more than his words allowed. Folks see what they need to see in a storm, he said. Sometimes the help is a man. Sometimes it's a push inside your own head that keeps your feet moving. He spit in the leaves. Either way, you got out. They thanked him and walked a little more, saying almost nothing. At a small clearing, Daniel picked up 2 straight branches and bound them with paracord into a rough cross. He set it in the ground near the bend, not to mark a grave, but to mark a fact. They stayed until the cold touched their fingers and reminded them it was time to go. They sat and listened to the water. The day grew thin around the edges. Mark finally spoke. I keep thinking about the way he said, up, like a father telling a kid to try again. Daniel smiled, a worn, quiet smile. I hear it too, he said. He wasn't trying to hold on to a miracle. He was holding on to a memory that felt heavier than wood and lighter than air. Winter came early that year. On the first Sunday of real snow, Daniel drove alone back to the state land. The cross he'd set still stood. tilted a little, core dark with weather. The woods were quiet, but not empty. Wind moved through bare limbs with a thin sound. The creek spoke in low syllables around rimmed stones. The air carried that clean iron smell that comes before the real cold locks everything down. Daniel stood with his hands in his coat pockets and let the scene settle into him like a weight he chose to carry. He replayed the moment without adornment, like a worker checking a joint for strength. He had been weak. He had been bleeding. He had been sure he would have to lie down and not get up again. Then hands slid under his arms, not dramatic, not showy, and he rose. He had felt the lift like a command from outside and from inside at the same time. Up. Simple as a word a carpenter says when he and another man share a load. He said the name now, quiet, the way you say the name of someone you know who has helped you in the dark. Jesus. He did not try to explain it to the trees or to himself. He did not argue for it. He let the name sit in the cold air and in his chest. He brushed a thin crust from the crossbar and tightened the cord. He thought of Emily and Caleb, of Mark sitting on his sister's old couch drinking soda and laughing at nothing. He thought of the chaplain's hand, of the paramedic's calm voice, of the deputy who didn't ask for more than the story he was given. A line connected all of it, running through the lift at the creek like wire, strong and quietly humming. He looked down, at his hands, the small scars, the dirt in the knuckles that never quite washes out, and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not power, not pride, just steadiness. A man could live a whole life on less, he thought, and still call it full. When he finally turned to go, he spoke again. Not a speech, not even a full prayer, only a plain sentence offered into the cold. Thank you for finding us. The words left his mouth and did not vanish. They hung in the air like breath, and then were taken up by the wind and the trees and the slow-moving water. On the drive home, the road ran straight for a long mile, and he let the truck roll without touching the gas. The world had edges again. The map made sense. Work would start early tomorrow. Bills would be paid. Caleb would wobble down the driveway on a too-big bike and then keep going. A man in a dark coat might step out of the corner of Daniel's memory now and then, and each time Daniel would feel that same sure pull under his arms. He didn't need more than that. Weak and bleeding then, steady now, he kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the next rise in the road, and he drove on into the ordinary light.